Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming, and I think that Russian foreign policy is quite interesting and complicated subject to grasp. And today I will do my best to introduce with economic dimension of Russian foreign policy. And the starting points would be observation made by two American political scientists made a few years ago, who was surprised to see how much Russia has managed to achieve with rather limited resources. And Russian activism by 2017 was indeed very much visible, not only in the post-Soviet space, but in other regions which go beyond, well beyond former USSR. But as a stressed, assessing motivations, consequences, and effectiveness is not well studied. And here we see basically the major puzzle, which I would like to explore in my presentation and the following Q&A session. Basically, what might be interesting for IR scholars is a rather big gap between quite limited Russian economic power on one hand and what Russians have achieved, at least in the short run, on international scene. Indeed, we know quite well that since 2014, prices on oil dropped from $150 per barrel to $50, just $100 decline, which is vital for Russian budget, for Russian strengths in general. Sanctions hit Russian economy quite strongly, and the government confessed publicly. The former Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, in one of public sessions said that Russia lost about $100 billion, which is also quite a big sum of money. Then, of course, capital flight did not stop, and brain drain, which is assessed in the range between 100,000 to 140,000 per annum. And it's not the West people who are living in this country. So taking together all those negative developments, we see that Russia still is rather successful in achieving its goals and objectives, at least in a post-Soviet space. So when we look at economic dimension, if we put Russia into context of international rankings, which data is available, and I just took data from World Bank, by GDP, official nominal GDP, Russia is just number 11, well behind many countries in the world. By purchasing power parity, the situation is a little bit better. Russia is number 6. But still, when we think about Russia's economic might in the comparative perspective, asymmetry in terms of economic power is really vast. Russia is well behind the United States. The ratio is 1 to 15 with the European Union. If we believe that our European Union is capable to speak in one voice, it's 1 to 10 or 1 to 11. And even within BRICS, there's a contact group where Russia is trying to play substantial role. Russia is just number 3, well behind China and India. So what is basically the structure of my presentation? What I'm going to discuss. First, I will look at debates on foreign policy tools. I see students, they know well, 3 dimensions of power in traditional IR thinking. Then we'll look at Russia's economic tools. What is basically in Putin's toolbox to achieve foreign policy objectives, how strong they are, and what Russia basically wants, and which role economic tools can play trying to see a change. And I think that the key question for any political scientist is to see a change from a status quo to a new type of situation. For instance, till late 90s, there were no big progress in integration, economic, political integration in the post-Soviet space, right? And today we see a collective security treaty organization, we see Eurasian Economic Union, and we see certain countries which are willing to join this integration process. And it did not happen just from thin air. It was, I would say, well planned, or at least planned to some extent, process, and Russia has managed to accumulate certain resources to this end. So, controlling agenda of other countries. Some countries are willing to go west, some countries are willing to go east to Asia, some countries are willing to sell the natural gas actually with substantial discounts to countries which Russia consider as potential markets, China. And how to control this agenda, how to help those countries return to the orbit of Russian foreign policy is a big issue. Or establishing preferences for particular countries. Which way to go is, I think, the key issue. So I will focus on primarily post-Soviet space. I will not speak a lot about, Venezuela, relationship with the guys who run the oil business in that country, or Africa, though there might be some questions about this. I will focus primarily in my presentation on post-Soviet space, what Russia has achieved, what are the major tools, instruments, and how it works. So, there is a big literature, again, for students, those names are well known, starting from Karl Marx, who was talking about dollar diplomacy and some other issues back to 19th century. Of course, the founder of classical realism, Professor Carr, who wrote about 20-year crisis, and I think that all students in international relations know quite well there are three types of power. One is military, the second one is economic, and the third is power of opinion, or what we call propaganda today. And of course, those types of power, they still present, and they may be labeled differently, but they still are quite substantial. And there is a big literature about sticks and carrots in foreign policy running. And carrots are positive sanctions when you basically endorse or give something to those who behave, and there are negative sanctions which are aimed against those who misbehave. And of course, in Russian toolbox, there are various instruments to use. Okay, key questions. What role do economic tools play in Russia's foreign policy today? How effective they are? We can speak about effectiveness looking first and foremost at achieved objectives. If you set a goal and you achieve it, you might say that you are effective. Or you can look at how much you invested to achieve a certain goal, right? And some countries achieve integration projects almost for free, or sometimes people have to pay enormously to achieve certain goals. And people might criticize, or pundits might criticize such way of behavior. Are there any serious limits for Russian activism in the post-Soviet space? What are the major hurdles on the way for further economic integration in the former USSR? So my main point, which I would like to make and argue, is that despite the huge asymmetry in power between Russia and the European Union, and Russia in the West in general, Russia has managed to achieve in the post-Soviet space much more than EU countries or the West combined, if we can speak about the West as something united. Through using various instruments such as market access, visa-free regime or access to a labor market, energy subsidy, financial assistance, which, to my estimate, well exceed what leading financial institutions, including IMF, World Bank, EBRD, provided to post-Soviet states combined. So, and the argument in terms of structure of my argument, I would say that why it happens so. The material dimension of Russian foreign policy should be kept in mind, but in addition to this, we have to think about strategic dimension of Russian foreign policy. The country has a strategy, clear strategy. If this strategy is persistent, if it exists for, not just for 1 year, 2 years, or 2 terms in office for 1 or 2 presidents, if there is a will to achieve this strategy, if there is a will to deliver, you might see a result. Because economic resources per se, they cannot just transform into objectives you are willing to achieve, right? There should be strategy and will. There should be a subjective factor which is important. There should be, qualified leadership. There should be people who will implement this particular strategy. And second, of course, every action which is undertaken in foreign policy should be taken in a very specific context. So we cannot just generalize in terms of general might, assuming that if American economy is much bigger than Russian, Americans will anyway, right? Or eventually they will anyway. So it's not the case. In a particular setting, because politicians act in space and time, and they have to achieve certain goals within limited space, there might be situations when, if you use your power in a smart way, you can achieve what you wish with limited resources. And of course, Russia is a special case. We all know that Russia can be classified or labeled as a strong state where civil society is rather weak, where commanding heights, by and large, belong to the state, especially in the key sectors of economy, which gives Russia a leverage over their neighbors, especially in oil, natural gas, and some other places. And in Russia, economy is based upon the cohort of so-called national champions, right? And in this situation, when you have the willingness to dominate, when you know that there are specialists in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and some other institutions who know how to use comparative advantages in this particular setting, and if you have control over predominant sectors of economy, you might win, basically. You might achieve the goals you set for yourself. So just let me make a step back and to return to types of power to show you, the context in which we can just discuss economic power of any given state, be it Finland, Germany, or France. So in terms of hard power, of course, I'm putting aside the military dimension. Economic power might be one of the key. Of course, it works in unison with military, and military power based upon economic capabilities of a state. But economic power can exist even without the military dimension. When we discuss the issues related to writing off debts, for instance, or providing energy subsidies, it has nothing to do with the military power, right? When we are talking about access to the markets for goods produced by your neighbors, be it wine, or mineral water, Georgia, fruits, vegetables, right? Milk or milk products, it depends not on your military power. It depends on the way what you want from your neighbor, right? What kind of policy you would like to encourage from opposite side. Of course, the second dimension of power is soft power. It's your attractiveness. You can dominate not only by putting your foods or pushing your potential foe or enemy or your opponent, but you can be attractive enough to convince the other side to work with you together, to join, for instance, integration groupings. And if you are capable to convince, you might win. And basically, Russia is trying to convince post-Soviet states that, being together with Russia on a number of issues, including being in the Eurasian Economic Union, is a winning position for them because they're becoming more influential and they have a say in agenda setting on a number of issues. And of course, I think that to most of you, this formula of power is well known from the Cold War era. One of the top CIA officials said that power is basically sum of population, territory, economy, and military multiplied by strategy and will. Here is a very important subjective dimension. I think that's why Russia is, rather successful so far in its foreign policy toward post-Soviet states is because, contrary to European Union, Russia perfectly knows what it wants in post-Soviet space. You know, there is a strategy and there is a clear will. And of course, there are several other definitions of power, which I think deserves our attention, and which can be used in order to understand the ability, let's say, to absorb pressure from Russia in neighboring states, its ability to make or resist the change. For instance, Belarus is not willing to become closer to Russia in its integration groupings, which means basically that Belarus has enough power to resist, right? So you can assess, at least in a maybe quite vague way, you know, the power of other countries, or ability to get what you want. So it's, the West is putting pressure on Russia, trying to make it behave in Ukraine, etc. And you see that the policy is not changing too much. So here's a graph which basically shows you that talking about economic tools of foreign policy requires, again, keeping in mind the context, overall context, dynamic interaction between different players on the international scene, their strategy, if there is any strategy. There might be the lack of strategy at all, and of course the skills. You know, if you use wisely what is at your disposal, you might achieve expected results. So what are economic instruments of Russia's foreign policy? Putin never hid it, that economic instruments are viewed as vital for achieving the goals Russia sets. If you read all of 5 foreign policy concepts which Russia adopted since 1993, the most recent version was 2016. In all of them, you know, there is a point which focuses on the importance of economic instruments, right? And here, in the most recent version of foreign policy concept, you see the goal which Russia sets in post-Soviet space, and which sounds like a common good, not only for Russia, but also for neighboring states, namely building new centers of economic growth and political power that will increasingly take responsibility for their respective regions. So basically what Russia is trying to say, how to achieve global economic stability, if every state, big state with resources, will take care about its neighborhood, everything will be perfect. If Germans will take about, you know, European Union, Germans and French, if Americans will take care about, you know, the Western Hemisphere, if Russians will take care about the post-Soviet space, why not? Why not? So the world will be stable. Basically, it's a return to sphere of influence argument, right? So it's maybe a little bit hidden, but the message is, okay, guys, just leave us alone. We know what to do in the post-Soviet space. We have the means, and we have a willingness, we have resources, and we can just spend some of those resources for the sake of this stability. So in order to be successful, and I think that this is a starting point of any debates about Russian economic policy, Russian foreign policy in general, in order to be proactive, and I would argue that Russian foreign policy in the post-Soviet space is proactive. You need resources, right? You should be attractive. You have to live better than, you know, your neighbors, by and large. And of course, you know, the key source of Russian, you know, relative might is Russia's oil, Russia's energy sector, right? And since 2016, Russia has managed to basically find a framework which allows Russia to get more or less fair price for its oil, right? You might know that in the 70s or in the early 80s, Russia and OPEC were at odds. They did not work together. And quite contrary, Saudi Arabia was always trying to kick off Russia from the oil markets, and there were price wars, and you might know that one of the reasons of collapse of the Soviet Union was radically declined prices on oil, which just reached $8 per barrel in early 80s, right? And in 1980s. Today, we see absolutely different situation. If you followed the most recent National Security Council meeting led by President Putin, he made a commitment to OPEC states to make cuts, if needed, of production of oil in order to stabilize oil markets. What does it mean? It means that Russia feels quite well working together with OPEC Plus, with 24 countries, other oil producers, in order to reach the price for oil, which allows Russia to be ambitious and to implement its foreign policy agenda. And this is a key. Prices on oil is a key, and I don't think that there is any substantial threats besides externalities like coronavirus in China, which can make those prices go radically down. Secondly, what Russia is doing, in order to be rather successful with its oil and gas, which basically provides two-thirds of Russian revenues and which make Russia relatively strong vis-a-vis its neighbors in the former Soviet Union. Of course, it's diversification of its export. In the early 90s, Russia basically believed that European Union is the only destination where we can export fossil fuel, be it oil, natural gas, or coal. Today, we see that Russia is moving toward Asia, to a large extent. Power of Siberia, and before that, oil pipeline to China, or increasing relationship with other, emerging or big consumers of oil, India in particular, which basically symbolize diversification of Russian oil export, provides, actually it is sort of a hedging strategy in terms of export, just to avoid the worst-case scenario which happened with Iran at some point. You remember the sanctions which were imposed by the West. And the third, and I think that very important dimension, which is missed in many analysis related to Russian foreign policy, is proactive policy to export nuclear power stations. And I would argue that this is maybe the most important thing what Russians do today in terms of building a long-term, lasting, positive interdependencies with the countries which are willing to build those nuclear power stations. Because what you basically do, when you build a pipeline, for how long it will exist? It might exist for 30 years, 40 years, maximum 50 years, right? If you provide maintenance services. When you build a nuclear power station, this is for a century. So you build, then you provide maintenance services, you deliver fuel, then you just take a spent fuel, and then you have to decommission this nuclear power station. And taking into account the lifetime of contemporary plants, it's 70 years. So we are talking about a century. So if you look at the portfolio of ROSATOM, which is going to build 33 reactors, that's actually, it's signed agreements. This means that those customers of ROSATOM, not only in post-Soviet space, of course, it's in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, etc. They will be, dependent in a good way from Russia till the 22nd century. So, and I would quote what one American observer said about such a strategy. So when you have enormous amounts of petrodollars coming from your exports, in order to keep macroeconomic stability, you could use it to build, invest into nuclear exports. So I just quote, Russia's decision to invest in nuclear energy capabilities is a brilliant strategic move. It recycles an unexpectedly large revenue stream provided by selling oil and gas into assets that will provide long-lasting power, right? And this is again, what is missed in many works on Russian economic tools. So, in addition to this, I would say that at the moment, and at least for the last maybe 20 years or maybe 15 years, Russia demonstrated its capability to withstand external shocks, be it sanctions or decline in oil prices, etc., due to sound macroeconomic framework. And you might know that the governor of Central Bank of Russia, Nabiullina, was named the best central banker of last year. Yeah, I think that in terms of quality, Russian financial sector and the government and executive branch of power is doing pretty well. Russia enjoys relatively high levels of international reserves, maybe the fourth biggest today, which is quite enough to cover imports in case of need, and low external debt, even in the commercial sector. If we compare the current situation with 2014, Russian big commercial sector has managed to repay its debt by 40%. What are cons? What can destabilize the situation with the Russian economy? Of course, in certain external environment, what Russia cannot control. Coronavirus, America first, let us make America great again. You know, who knows who will be the next American president. To some extent, unpredictability of development in European Union, because, you know, there is a clear lack of leadership in the EU, and this is basically one of the major concerns in Russia, since European Union is the biggest trade partner of Russia. So when we look at Russia's relationship with Eurasian Economic Union, what do we see? We see a huge asymmetry in power. And again, those who studied international political economy, you might remember the classical book by Professor Hirschman, written in 1945, when he basically discussed what kind of asymmetry is enough to basically dominate, you know, other states. He was looking at Germany in particular and the neighbors of Germany in the 30s before Nazi came to power. But here you see, you know, the situation when Russia, you know, enjoys overwhelming advantage in all dimensions, in terms of population size, in terms of GDP, in terms of foreign trade, in terms of per capita income. And this is vital, since if you look at statistics about purchasing parity per capita, Russians, or people in Russia in general, live much better than any country of the former Soviet Union, excluding Baltic states. Of course, I'm putting them aside. Here is, you know, just guess what this chart shows. Any guess? Basically, it's Gazprom office, and there is a pipelines which basically shows, you know, the wide network of Russian pipelines coming from Siberia to post-Soviet space and further to Europe. You know, it's a huge, you know, network or web, which basically explains that many countries in the post-Soviet Union space are either recipients or consumers of Russian commodities, oil or gas, and they make a lot of money on this transit, or they just in between the final destination of Russian commodities. So, a few words about sanctions and measures of encouragement or punishment for political purposes. You know, there is a list of positive sanctions, which Russia, you know, wisely or unwisely used. You know, it's a matter of your taste. One is energy subsidies. Energy subsidies. Some of you might say that you cannot provide energy subsidies to anybody, especially when we are talking about WTO member states, right? But there are exceptions, and there are ways to bypass such kind of regulations. I'll give you just one figure. Russia provided Ukraine with annual oil subsidies before color revolution in an amount of $5.5 billion US. So from 1991 on to 2004, every year Russians subsidized Ukraine with $5.5 billion US. So it's 14 years, and all in all, it's about $90 billion. Did Ukraine become obedient to Russia's wishes in terms of its integration projects, be it political integration, economic integration? You know, answer is clear, not. Ukraine, you know, he was just taking those subsidies, they were enjoying those subsidies, but result was less than Russia hoped for, right? So, and this is a big question for all of us, you know, which instruments are more effective when you give carrots or when you use sticks, right? And, you know, Ukraine has changed a little bit its foreign policy since they understood that there is a huge gap in their budget, and they have to cover somehow this budget. And you know that Yushchenko has lost elections. He was number 5, mainly because he was not able to find, you know, any kind of alternative to generous Russian oil subsidies. And the same goes today with Lukashenko, right? I know, I don't know to what extent you closely follow the Belarusian relationship, but, you know, Belarus was also on receiving end of Russian relatively cheap energy until recently. Second positive, favorable market access for goods and services. If you think, for instance, what is a major trading good of Belarus? How they make their budget? Any guess? How Comrade Lukashenko, you know, is oil, yeah. So the waste was oil. What else? Oil, yes. So, and what's the type of business Belarusians do with oil? Do they produce oil? No, they do not produce oil. They buy oil from Russia at quite low prices, and they have good refineries, right? And they just sell it to Europe at, you know, at world prices. And basically, this is the very simple way to explain the relative financial, political, economic stability in Belarus. But in addition to this, Belarus is very strong in its agricultural production, right? So milk and milk products makes 10% of their budget. Milk and milk products. But where they can sell the milk and milk products? Europe? No, European market is very busy, is overwhelmed. So only Russia, right? Yeah, so actually, not surprisingly that from time to time we see so-called milk wars between Minsk and Moscow. So at some point, Muscovites discover something wrong in milk, or in cream, or in other milk products, and then puts a ban, and then after 3 months of negotiations, it became clear that Belarusians are supposed to do something, right? And they have to guess what they're supposed to do, etc. So basically market access. Market access for wine from Moldova, for instance. Do you know whether Moldovan wine is good or bad? Did you try? I think, you know, it's quite good, but from time to time you can find some kind of nasty ingredients in this wine. The same goes with Georgian wine or with Georgian sparkling water. So which means that if you don't have guaranteed access to other markets, you are doomed to think how to negotiate and how to, you know, negotiate from position of weakness with a country which is your traditional trading partner. So this is a, you know, very important and a very strong economic tool. Favorable market access for goods and services. Then provision of aid, cheap loans, investment guarantees, etc. So where it's easier to get financial support from International Monetary Fund to BRD, European Union, United States, or from neighboring state, from a single state named Russia. And, you know, the guess is, yes, from Russia it's easier, because if you negotiate with IMF, there will be conditions, you know, difficult conditions, and moreover, it will take you maybe a year or so to get this money, right? And then there will be quite strong mechanism of surveillance, and you have to all the time reports, maybe every quarter, every 3 months, and it's a nightmare for any bureaucracy. Transaction costs will exceed what you get, you know, in terms of financial support. You know, with Russia it's easier. You can come to Moscow and ask Vladimir Vladimirovich, just give me a hand, help me. Yes, you know, I have a problem. And Russia, together with Kazakhstan, has created a $10 billion bank to help those countries who are in need. And the lion's share of this money came from Russian taxpayers, 9 million out of 10. Then, liberal migration regime. Does it matter for post-Soviet space to have a country which has one of the most liberal migration regimes? What would be your guess? How much people in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan get from remittances of those guys who work here in Russia? What's the percentage? In case of Tajikistan, it's more than 42%. 42%. In case of Kyrgyzstan, it's about 30. Even Ukrainians in 2015 were coming here, in big number to 2.5 million people and made a lot of money. Basically 10% of, or a little bit less than 10% of GDP of Ukraine in 2015, after Crimea, came from Russia. Okay, so you are over-dependent, and who decides what kind of migration regime will be in place? The state, right? Russia. It's up to Moscow to decide, and of course you can just invoke security reasons to stop those migrations. You can reject work permits, right? So it's a sovereign right of every state. Even within the European Union, you do this. And keeping this legal migration regime is a very important, I would say, economic tool. So if, for instance, you reject access for people from Tajikistan, it means that the guys will not get money, and there will be, high level of unemployment. There might be socioeconomic problems, which can basically escalate into political turmoil, right? So in order to be on good terms, you have to think how to, meet expectations of a country which allows you to send your labor force. Negative sanctions. There is a lot of tons of literature about so-called gas weapon. Frankly speaking, I'm not a person who would say that Russia tried to use this gas weapon against anybody. If you don't sign a contract, like there was a case with Ukraine, if you cannot agree on the price, it's quite legitimate to just wait when you will be ready to accept this price, right? Or negotiate this price. But what Russia was frequently used at so-called non-tariff barriers to trade, which are not prohibited by WTO, as you might know. Non-tariff barriers to trade, various type of bans which can be imposed in order to protect your security. Right, you might remember that at a certain point, maybe a few years ago, there was a ban put on cucumbers from Spain in Germany, right? So even within the European Union, there are cases when you are using those bans. In the Russian case, there were several cases of embargo or just a terminal ban, which basically led to a devastating impact on the economy of affected countries. Or tough position on that issue. So you might be quite flexible, or you can just go to commercial courts and demand that the country, for instance, Ukraine, pay in full for money borrowed by President Yanukovych, right? If you remember what happened in the beginning of 2014. Or ban for migrants or visa-free regime. So I would say that there is a combination of positive and negative instruments which Russia used quite frequently, and I would say in accordance with international law, quite wisely. Not necessarily achieved everything it was willing to achieve, but basically in the long run, as I said in my opening words, Eurasian Economic Union is a reality, and Collective Security Treaty Organization as a nucleus for further enlargement of integration groups is also here. This is a graph in which I try to summarize both Russia's interest and instruments which were exploited vis-a-vis post-Soviet states. Of course, I excluded from my analysis Baltic states because it's absolutely irrelevant. And Russia's interest, if we summarize those interests, refer to maybe three major types of interest. First of all, in terms of hard security, it's fighting international terrorism, creating collective security treaty organization and military bases for Russian troops. Second dimension deals with economic integration, Eurasian Economic Union in particular, and fighting soft security threats, non-military threats, fighting against drugs, illegal migration, etc. And the third dimension of Russia's objectives in the full post-Soviet space was, of course, the status of compatriots, Russian-speaking population. And you might know that after collapse of USSR, 25 million Russians, they had to adjust to their new homelands. And 25, it's a huge loss. That's why Putin, in one of his interviews, called collapse of USSR the biggest tragedy of 20th century. But then he repeated that those who would like to restore, those who do not regret, they don't have a heart. Those who would like to restore USSR, they don't have a brain. But normally in the West, the second part of this statement is omitted in order to demonstrate, that Putin is thirsty for restoration of the Soviet Union, which is not the case. Okay, and on this slide also you see instruments which Russia using vis-a-vis all those countries. Energy subsidies, yes. Market access, transit. Most countries, especially from Central Asia, which are rich in energy resources, they view Russia as a way to the most lucrative market for them, which is European Union. Right, and Kazakhstan, the major interest of Kazakhstan in the Eurasian Union, maybe, arguably, the main interest is to have unrestricted access to European market via Russia. The same goes with Turkmenistan and other countries which are in between, which do not have access to either high seas or Europe. In some cases, Russia's economic instruments or goals in general are quite modest. If we take, for instance, the case of Turkmenistan, what was Russia's goal? Just to agree the status of Caspian Sea and to avoid unnecessary competition with Russian gas in China. Right, so this is quite modest goals. In terms of compatriots in Turkmenistan, the policy of Turkmenbashi and his successor was that most Russians just came home or came to other places. Of course, they do not need energy subsidies, market access. They don't produce too much except for natural gas. And Turkmenistan maybe is the easiest case. When we talk about Ukraine, of course, hard security was a key for the whole period of independent Ukraine. The status of Russian Black Sea Fleet, the division of Black Sea Fleet, and non-NATO status. This was a key goal of our relationship with Ukraine. And of course, in terms of economic integration, transit of oil and gas, since Ukraine is a major transit state for Russian fossil fuel. And eventually, the biggest prize to win in relationship with Ukraine, to return it to Russia's orbit, political and economic. And of course, it will take time. And, I might argue that without good relationship with Russia, Ukraine can hardly recover as a state. And here you see one of the major tools in relations with post-Soviet countries in Asia, in Central Asia. And here on this slide you see that Russia provides an opportunity for Tajiks, Kyrgyz, people, and even people from Armenia and Georgia to make quite a lot of money working in Russia. Though you know that there is no diplomatic relationship between Russia and Georgia, right? And Switzerland is trying to play a role of providing good services, but still, remittances from Armenia constitute substantial parts of Georgian GDP. And as I already mentioned, Ukraine also highly dependent on remittances with more than $6 billion in 2015. $6 billion. It's much more than, again, all combined assistance from the West was delivered to Kiev. So if you put together IMF loans, EU credits, or United States help, it's still less than those $6.2 billion US. What are outcomes of this economic policy of Russia? Again, there is a debate whether we can say that the Russian economic policy towards the former Soviet Union was a success story or not. I assess by achieved results. There was a goal to see tangible institutions where Russia occupies a leading position, and those institutions do exist. Eurasian Union, is getting bigger. Most former Soviet Union states, in one form or another, return to Russian economic and even political orbit. And as I said, my guess is that normalization of relationship with Ukraine will help Kiev to recover economically and to survive economically and politically. What are reasons of relative success? I see that there might be a lot of skepticism about what Russian government or President Putin is doing, but I think that, again, I'm returning to this particular point. There is a strategy. And again, if you are trying to understand whether Russia was serious or not about any particular country or region, just look at who was assigned to run this mission. So in case of former Soviet Union, at some point, the former director of foreign intelligence was assigned to be in charge, right? And for Russia, for those who a little bit know Russian political elite today, this is a litmus test to say that Russia is serious about this, right? Before that, who worked at the Yeltsin administration, for instance, was former Soviet Union. Those who failed, the losers. And that's why there was absolutely mass in the former Soviet Union. Since late 90s and the early 21st century, the situation has radically changed. Tell me who runs the business and I'll tell you, whether Russia is serious about this or not. Second issue, I think, which is also important, ability to concentrate resources to achieve expected results. Of course, maybe in the long run, the national champions, on this model with national champions, will not be very efficient. So it's not very sound from economic perspective because there is a lack of normal competition, right? But ability to play as a unified actor is important. For instance, just take this case, how to negotiate with OPEC Plus in order to make substantial cuts in production of oil. If you work in the market economy, if you have, let's say, 30 or 40 medium-sized oil companies, how you will distribute those losses? Some people would say, no, we are not interested. We are not willing to play this game, right? So you will have to find those who would be smart or eager to sacrifice, and those who will eventually lose in financial terms. Of course, you can find instruments to compensate later, but if you have few companies which play a predominant role, and basically what you need to do, you have to agree with few people, right, about cuts. And this is what we see since 2016. So, when you deal with companies, national champions, where the state occupies a leading position, it's much easier to agree about those cuts. Of course, playing game against former Soviet Union, it's like the game of Barcelona against football club from St. Petersburg. If you have a predominant position, if you have predominant power, skills, and ability to exploit your resources, you are doomed to win, right? But there is a huge leverage over former Soviet Union states in terms of almost all kinds of resources. And up to now, as I said, European Union did not become a real alternative. And maybe yet another very important factor, post-Soviet countries, they tried their independence, right? So they live independently, and they basically departed from Russia since collapse of the USSR. They tried to live on their own, and they understood that's not big interest for their future, from EU for sure, from the United States also, and from China as well. And I think that this is yet another quite important effect which we have to keep in mind. You know, the sobering effect of political elites in most post-Soviet states. So it happens so that Russia may be the best, maybe not very convenient, but the best partner who has stakes and interest and is ready to invest into the development. Summing up, what are limits of economic power of Russia? Of course there are limits. Of course there are limits, and the first limit is that Russian economy is stable, but it's not growing as fast as it was expected, right? You know, what is our average growth rate today for world economy before coronavirus began? 3.5%. In Russia, it's just 1.6, 1.7. So Russia, basically, the gap between developed countries or emerging powers like China is increasing, right? So in terms of power relations, Russia is not getting stronger in general. But the question is whether those who are getting stronger will be willing to take advantage of Russia, and they will be willing to project their power, economic power, in the regions which Russia considers being vital for its future. Second limitation is the fact that China is getting more and more interested in Central Asia in particular, with a number of different projects, and how to find a compromise with China will be the big issue and will be the big challenge for the future. You know, there are structural realists like John Gersheimer who predict serious conflicts and serious tensions between Russia and China in the future in Central Asia. But of course, I think that Russians are well aware about limits of the economic power. They will do their best to balance growing China and not to rely exclusively on strategic partnership with Beijing. And maybe the final point I would like to make before opening floor for your questions. I would just repeat, maybe the obvious to most of you, that in politics what matters is first and foremost relative power of states. So it's absolutely fruitless to discuss, GDP as such. So the key issue is, if you want to achieve something, you have to concentrate, you have to be coherent in your policy, and you might become, you might win in the end. The cases which I studied in relationship between Russia and its neighbors, in some cases it was enough to explore one tool. In some cases, Russia, just employed two instruments. Sometimes, there was a need to use all instruments available. But if you are capable to develop well-tailored economic policy to every particular state, you might win. So I will stop on this, and will be happy to answer your questions, if any. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if you have a question, please raise your hand.
Oh, Professor, thank you very much. Russia has a highly educated population and workforce. It has wonderful resources. What are the main reasons for Russia having such a tiny GDP compared to its population? Is it because oil and gas and other resources have made the country lazy? Is it because it hasn't recovered from communism yet? Is it because of the sanctions? Is it because of competition? What is the reason?
Okay, so thank you for your question. My answer will be maybe I will not satisfy you, but I will start that Russia, after collapse, lost 100 million of its population, right? Russia basically had to go through 3 revolutions at once. Russia had to shift from communism to build democracy, right? Or at least in the 90s it became clear that Russia decided to change its political system. Second revolution was an economic domain, right? To shift from common economy to market economy, which is not easy. When you see emergence of new stakeholders, which became at some point very powerful, and you know that as a result of privatization, a group of oligarchs have emerged in the mid-90s, which basically privatized the state. And one of the first missions for new presidents to implement, for President Putin, an advice given by one of leading authorities in transition politics on the pages of Foreign Affairs was to somehow to deal with those oligarchs, right? So of course it takes you time, it takes you some maybe reputation, it absorbs enormous resources, right? And the third revolution was basically just dismantling of the Soviet Empire and reinventing themselves. And first time in history, since the late 19th century, Russians became a predominant majority in the country. In late 19th century, according to census, Russians constituted less than 43% of population. In 1991, it was 80, right? Who are we? It's, it's not only existential question, it's identity issue, right? Which direction we should go? Should we go to Europe? Or should we go to just stay as we are? Are we, unique civilization, right? And again, it's not a factory. So yesterday you produced, let's say tanks, and tomorrow you'll produce a Mercedes because, you're on good terms with German Chancellor and he owes you for reunification of Germany. It does not work this way, right? So the change in elite, the change in institutional framework, a lot of changes, Russia had to deal with simultaneously, right? And that's why I would say that in the 90s, Russia was just trying to survive as a state. 2 wars against Chechnya, bloody wars, but still there were wars. And those wars absorbed enormous amounts of resources and legitimacy of a state, or from the state, because, you might remember that in 1996, Yeltsin had to sign an agreement with Chechens on very bad terms. Basically, Chechnya became de facto independent republic. And by the time Putin came to office, there were more than 1,000 regional laws which contradicted the Russian constitution. 1,000. At that time, there were 89 republics or regions in the Russian Federation. So there was no common legal space. So which means that people in Tatarstan had a different legal framework for running business than those who lived in Moscow and St. Petersburg, etc. You could not talk about the synergy. And you could not use resources available for economic growth, right? And then what happened, in the 90s, Russia was believing, maybe naively, that the time of military confrontation is over. We should not spend a lot on the military buildup. And even if you look at the Russian budget, and I think budget will tell you more than any professor like me, Russia spends on hard security less than on soft security, which means that Russia believed in EU agenda of security, that Cold War is over and we have to deal with nuclear safety, we have to upgrade our nuclear reactors in order to avoid Chernobyl catastrophe, right? We have to think about Baltic Sea, we have to clean Baltic Sea together with Finns, Swedes, etc., Helcom, etc. Then we have to fight drugs, infectious diseases like coronavirus. At that time it was tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS, right? And we spent on this more than on the military. And then Yugoslavia happened, then Iraq happened, then Libya happened, and it became clear, and of course Chechnya. So we lost the first war, and we, hardly won the second war, right? And it became clear that the military factor will absorb some resources, right? And what we've seen since 2008, when again it became clear that Russia was not well prepared to win a war against the tiny Georgia, 5-day war, you remember. The lessons were learned, and the Russians adopted a massive program to modernize its military, right? So in military, when you have to take care about the military security, again, it absorbs huge resources. And the external situation was not favorable, You remember Munich speech by Putin in 2007, where he just openly said that we have a troublemaker in our house. It's the United States. And since then, Russia was viewed very negatively by Washington. And before that, it was viewed quite negatively. And there was a Bucharest summit, a commitment to Georgia and Ukraine to see them someday as member states, right? The doors are open, and again. In order to grow fast, in order to grow like, let's say, Poland, you need a favorable external environment, right? Russia was rejected membership in WTO till 2012, and this was a huge mistake, and this basically did not allow Russian small and medium-sized business develop as it should be developing. Russia was excluded from European or Euro-Atlantic security frameworks, and they had to take care about its security by its own. And this all, to my mind, maybe I'm wrong, created what we see today, when we spent 100 billion rubles, or to 20 trillion rubles, 700 billion US dollars on military modernization. Yeah, so this is just a historical background for us to understand where Russia is today. And taking into account this background, I wouldn't say that Russia is doing bad. I'm saying that Russia is doing quite good. It could be better, of course. It could be better if Russia and the EU worked together on a number of issues. If, for instance, Europe would accept what is called in political science Finlandization for many post-Soviet states, and would not push Ukraine, Georgia, and some other countries which feel insecure into NATO. And I think that this would become down relationship between Russia and the West, and then we might see this economic growth which Russia can achieve. But waging yet another Cold War, and spending billions on military hardware, living under sanctions, and to see 1.5% of economic growth, I think that sounds, it's quite a good achievement. So, some people say that the glass is half empty. I would say that it's half full.
Thank you. Other questions?
Thank you so much for this historical view over the 90s. If you would actually add up just a bit more on one of your points, that was that Russia during the 90s and early 2000s was I think my question was not good, so I think I should change it. So I changed this one. I go to the next one.
Okay, excuse me.
All right, yeah. So, what do you mean by saying that Russia was actually excluded from formats of cooperation or integration into the Euro-Atlantic or Euro frameworks? That would be my first one. Mm-hmm. And the second one would be regarding projection of power. So, according to your analysis, how much does the projection of power outside the Russian borders drag from the economic output of the Russian Federation?
Yeah, so let me start with the second question. So the implied idea of your second question is that Russia's Eurasian Economic Union is driven by political consideration rather than economic ones. But Eurasian Economic Union as such and the size of the Kazakh economy, the Russian economy are big enough. It's 40 million people. No country is willing to lose 40 million people. Actually, it's I think that economy of scale and access to markets where your goods are competitive is a plus. I can tell you that it works in both directions, right? Just 3% of goods produced in Eurasian economic industrial goods in the Eurasian Economic Union are competitive in the United States, and 5% in the European Union. So we mostly speak about the trade within Eurasian Economic Union, and I would, if you are interested, you can look at articles by David Tarr. So he's a well-known economist and used to work for World Bank, and he published quite a lot on economic integration in post-Soviet states. And he, basically analyzed, the achievements and failures of this economic integration. So what did I mean saying that Russia was rejected, right? Simply when Russia was willing to be treated as an equal, its voice was not heard when the question of NATO expansion was discussed at all. You remember, for knowledge, in 1996, the West supported Yeltsin against Zyuganov in elections for Russian president. The same year, NATO, or Washington, better to say, made a decision to invite 3 former Central European countries to NATO: Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic. Chubais, head of staff, went to Washington and met with Clinton, and he said, this is a no-confidence vote to Russian democracy, right? So people in Russia and political landscape in Russia will radically change. So you will see the rise of nationalism. And it was not only Chubais who said the obvious. George Kennan said this, and he said this was a fateful error by the United States expansion of NATO. And basically there was a commitment when the process of reunification of Germany was taking place that NATO would not expand. It was not legally binding, but today there are, again, numerous articles in international security, for instance, and some other well-respected academic periodicals which basically prove that there was a commitment by James Baker, the former Secretary of State, not to expand NATO eastward. So here is a key issue for Russia. Security was #1 priority for 3 centuries, so-called stabilization of frontiers. And I think that every country is mostly concerned with national security. And when you see, the fact that, the military political bloc, which you viewed as an adversary, is moving closer to your borders, it's not a good news for any person with military education, because your infrastructure are coming closer to you. And when you see later that the United States decided to withdraw from ABM Treaty, so missile defense, especially after September 11th, you remember, Colin Powell, when he came to St. Petersburg, he said, so our missile defense will be not against you, but against the guys from Iran or Korea or somebody else. Okay, so you basically perfectly understand that the country which viewed itself as a winner in the Cold War was trying to just, get an advantage at your expense, right? And all those issues related to security and absolute ignorance to President Medvedev a suggestion about new pan-European security architecture, which he made in 2008, just before Olympic Games and before Mikhail Saakashvili's decision to return back South Ossetia. Those 14 points by Dmitry Medvedev were rejected. But what was major point? You cannot build your Atlantic security on the basis of exclusion. So it's out of 55 states of Europe, only 27 are protected, and others what they're supposed to do. And the point was that we have to just think about this at least, and we have to incorporate China in the talks about Euro-Atlantic security arrangements. Sooner or later, this Chinese factor will be taken into account. It's one dimension, security dimension. On economic dimension, as I said, I'm already repeating myself. Russia was rejected for a number of years from membership in WTO, World Trade Organization. What is a major form of international economic activity or international economic relations? It's trade, right? Through trade, you create, lobbying groups, you foster, innovations, you just basically help your opponent or your partner, if you wish, just build sound small and medium-sized enterprises, and through this, you create taxpayers. True citizens, right? Those who don't live on rent, oil rents. So the major argument against the contemporary political regime in Russia is that there are not too many true citizens because they're just receiving some peanuts from oil revenues, right? If you have normal economy with those sound size of small and medium-sized enterprises, you will have an absolutely different structure. But what the West was doing at that period of time, they were concentrated on getting back, what the USSR owed, $83 billion. That's it. So no word about integration. And again, security first, and the security dimension was, quite threatening to Russia, at least. And again, quite provocative statements that NATO would expand and will incorporate the former Soviet republics. So this was viewed as absolutely unacceptable. And that's why, the Russian leadership took a risk. Maybe high risk, but, at least, there are red lines. And now we have what we have. So we have to first accept that both sides maybe committed some mistakes, which is very difficult for the West. The West is not willing to remind what happened in February of 2014 when the deal was made between France, Poland, or in presence of France, Germany, and Poland about the Ukrainian settlement and transformation of power in Ukraine, when Ukraine had to change its political system from presidential to parliamentary republic, early elections of president, and willingness to Yanukovych not to use force against protesters. 3 foreign ministers were present, they endorsed this deal, and the next day it was just nothing. So revolution took place. And of course, these type of things, are viewed in Russia up to now quite negatively, and you have to understand. So for Russia, it was the second broken promise. The first one, expansion of NATO. The second, the deal over Ukraine, and just I think that we have to try to. I would say that's why I think that Russia was thinking that it was rejected. So the voice of Russia, the interests of Russia were not heard at all. On security dimension, on economic dimensions, etc.
I don't want to make this a ping pong. I mean, it's just one more thing, and then because of course there are plenty of other questions. If I may add to that, wouldn't it be more taking care or taken into account rather than rejected? Because I would like to bring to your attention the fact that Russia has been constantly invited to formats, from NATO, Russia Council, to Eastern Partnership, to most of the initiatives that there were there. And of course, if there is something that we should take into account is the fact that in the big in between, as it was called, that is the the Eastern, the Central and Eastern Europe, and of course the former Soviet republics. They all, they weren't just some pieces around the area. They all had a bit of eagerness to step up from their position and to look towards a different, a way or a different direction. So this is something that I would like to add a bit to your. So rejection, I don't know if it's real rejection. This just.
Yeah, just, again, let me respond. So Russia is the country which views itself as a, great power. Not just because of ballet or ice hockey, Gagarin, but, there are many merits which I think allows Russia to think this way. What happened in 2001 when NATO offered Russia this council, Russia-NATO Council? Russia was not allowed to participate in any decisions related to NATO expansion, to missile defense. So two key issues which was on Russian mind in terms of security. I would remind you that what Russia delivered before Russia was invited to this NATO-Russia Council, Russia basically shared military intelligence with the United States about Afghanistan, about warlords, about infrastructure, how to save lives of American soldiers who were supposed to be sent to United States. Russia basically put certain political pressure on Central Asia to allow Americans to open up military bases just to save time and make it easier for Americans to reach Al-Qaeda military bases, right? In number of issues, a number of concessions were made. So it was not just a gesture of goodwill, because I would argue that Putin did quite a lot to help Bush, to be strong against this terrorist threat after September 11th, to deliver, to demonstrate that he is a strong leader. So, you can, there was a debate in the United States. If you're interested, you can look at the article, joint article by Sergei Karaganov and Graham Allison. And Allison suggested that Russia might be invited to NATO, or United States might have a special agreement on security with Russia, which not necessarily be, Russia in NATO. But, it was rejected. It was rejected. It was said, okay, no. So winners get everything, and Russia is a loser. So why we should, give Russia a veto? If Russia is a member of NATO, Russia would get a veto over decisions of NATO. So NATO would be ruined from the very beginning. That's why what NATO basically suggested, a seat in a waiting room. And to see and observe how decisions are made on substantial issues in Russia's presence, but without Russia. This framework was not, I would say, workable or acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you for a really interesting lecture. And well, to come back to the hard security, that one of Russia's main issues was NATO's expansion to its borders. Well, I have definitely a really naive question concerning that. Shouldn't it be like the decision of those states who joined NATO, whether they join NATO or not, rather than Russia's decision? Because, at least most of those states have had some really, let's say, not very pleasant historical experience with Russia's military. So, that's my naive question. Why isn't their sovereign decision whether they join NATO or not?
Yeah, very simple answer. It's not only when you knock the door may be open or just rejected, right? So basically it was up to member states to invite and to consider consequences for the whole European architecture, Euro-Atlantic architecture, security architecture, whether you win or lose from such a decision. Of course, it's your sovereign decision. But, again, many countries were willing to join NATO, but not all of them were accepted, right? Not all of them. So, and, just not to play, a game of naiveness that if I want to join, I will be immediately accepted. Gorbachev, during the last years of the Soviet existence, suggested that USSR might join the NATO. Of course, it was just provocative. Why not? He was rejected. And I think that, of course, there are many countries in Central and Eastern Europe who have a long list of bad memories, and maybe the way how they behave and see Russia is well-deserved, maybe. But the problem is that Russia today has to pay for sins committed by communists. And this is in my opinion, is just a big confusion in the minds of those who seek membership in NATO. So they still see Moscow the same, or at least in '96. They see Moscow the same way they seen communist Russia. Again, I'm referring to the point of '96. Yeltsin won. The guy who basically gifted freedom to Baltic states, who was the first to recognize independence of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, who was the first who recognized independence of Georgia, right? This person, you could hardly accuse him for, and he was the first, the president who basically did his best to withdraw Russian troops before the schedule, agreed schedule with the same Latvia, right? Who decided to withdraw his troops from East Germany before the schedule, right? So you could hardly excuse then, in that context, the person and those in a circle around him for being, anti-Latvian, anti-Estonian, and anti-Czech. He basically asked for, for pardon for what happened in Katyn. He exchanged, the documents when then Polish President Walesa, etc., etc., etc. So we are talking about '96. I'm talking about the context, right? Remember what happened, in 1918, the Germans, there was a revolution, November Revolution in Germany. They came to power, Weimar Republic was created. Democrats had to pay for sins committed by Kaiser. In the early 90s, the situation repeated. Those who managed to dismantle communism had to pay for sins of communists. And I said that the golden opportunity was missed. Those 5 years or 6 years, formative years of building of this transformation from communist regime to democracy or democratization at least. So, and there were elections, there were free elections of governors, Council of Federation was elected, etc., etc. If you wish, you can look at chronology and the history, and of course there are again tons of books about this. And what followed, and Russia's take on NATO expansion should be interpreted in the historical context as well. But it seems that for many people in Central Asia, in the post-Soviet Union, Russia and Moscow is stable. It's a stable monster, right? And again, I'm a historian by background. I'm looking always in the historical context. And for me, context means quite a lot, and it's quite convincing.
Yes, perhaps as a remark on this exchange of views, I think there can be forever discussion about what happened in the 90s, and I think there is a fascinating parallel to be made for historians about what happened in Western Europe after the Second World War and what didn't happen in the former Eastern European area after 1990. In one case, a few years after the war for various reasons, but former belligerents were entering the same structures, alliances, France and Germany and Italy and all these countries which had fought terribly, and this certainly didn't take place. And what is striking me is that 30 years after 1990, the situation is perhaps worse than it was in the 1990s, in the sense that narratives have solidified in each part, which means that 90% of Russians are convinced of what you said, which is that the West has excluded voluntarily Russia, and 90% of people in Poland, Romania, Baltic states and others are convinced that the problem is that Russia is still a threat for them, and that has not made any progress at all. So I think that the real question mark for us today is perhaps not what took place in the 90s, that's interesting for historians, is whether it can change in the 30 next years, because that is a very striking issue for me. But perhaps it's a very big debate. So coming back to your expose, I realized that I have never been able to know whether economic power is soft or hard power, and through your enlightening expose, I understood it might be both. It's soft power when it's mainly the nice side of power, dependency which is accepted or tolerated, and things like that. And the example of nuclear power, nuclear stations, nuclear technology is very enlightening indeed. And then there is the time when economic power might become hard power, so you try to use the soft power you created, and you try to twist the arm of the partner which has developed dependency with you. I think it's very interesting. My remark is that whenever you do that, it has consequences. I mean, we saw that when there was a last negotiation with Ukraine to know whether there would be a new agreement on supplies of gas to Ukraine and the issue of areas and so on. And everybody was watching around what would take place, because if there had not been an agreement, it would not have been only an issue for Russia and Ukraine. I mean, what was at stake was also the reliability of Russia as a supplier to Western Europe. And Western European markets are not, even with Nord Stream and so on, even with pipelines today, gas markets are not captive markets. You can buy from the pipelines, or you can buy more and more LNG from the United States from fracking. So the competitive situation has become very different, at least for Western Europe. For Ukraine it is not, but because fortunately for Russia, Ukraine remains very poorly managed in economic terms, is not able to balance its accounts, and so it remains very dependent. It creates arrears with Russia on gas. So Ukraine remains someone you can have this arm-twisting relation. A catastrophe for Russia in terms of geopolitical power would be time when Ukraine would put its house in order and would be able to pay its gas to Russia. Then the leverage, the geopolitical leverage of gas supplies would be much diminished. So my point is about Russia handled its tools fairly adequately, as you mentioned during the last period. It used the leverage of various sorts of leverage, which are gas, which are visa, labor remittances, and visa policy, and so on, fairly adequately. It's also because when you say that there is a competition between Russia and the European Union, for example, I would tend to be very nuanced about that. In Central Asia, the European Union is not competing with Russia. If anybody is competing, it's China today, and it becomes real because even migrants are going to China now. I understand that it's not so automatic that they come to Russia because China is willing to have more manpower from these countries as well. But in Central Asia, there is no competition with the European Union, not even with the United States today. The United States, it's not the 90s anymore. Caucasus, well, arguable. Ukraine and so on, yes, up to a point, but still it's clear that the level of priority of these countries for Russia is much higher. I'm sorry to say that, I'm very politically incorrect, but it's true that for Russia it's a very, very big priority, so it's willing to use all it can to exert an influence. For the European Union or the United States, yes, it's important, but I would argue that the relative level of priority is not the same. So, are we competitors up to a point? And is it a win-lose competition? I mean, do you win a country and then it will be yours? I would argue very much not, because Belarus is a fascinating example today on how you can try to pivot and to balance so as not to be too dependent. And all these countries are playing these games, even the Central Asian countries, which are some of them fairly weak, they try to balance the various, so yes, they are dependent on Russia, but they try to have strong relations with China, if possible to keep good relations with the West, and as long as Russia is not able to control the selection of leaders in this country, and so far it is not, you have this situation of where you don't win a country forever, and if you exert your pressure too much, then the country will try to rebalance its external relations so as not to be as dependent. So it's a more subtle game than just saying this is my zone of influence, and in my zone of influence I am the king, I sort of.
Yeah, so I would agree with what you said, but I would just add one point. You absolutely correctly observed that maybe predominant majority of people in Russia, just not necessarily experts, but rank and file people, would believe that the massacre around Ukraine in November, December of 2013, when Yanukovych rejected to sign association agreement, and mass protests began, etc., was the Western plot, and was a mistake by Germany or EU in general. While in European Union or European countries and new member states, Russia is evil forever. But what changed basically for the last 30 years, and I think that this is again underestimated. The whole new generation of Russians have emerged, those guys and ladies who are educated, most of them not only in Russia, but had a chance to visit the West and see by their own eyes how those systems work, and that's a much more open society, and the mere fact that we meet here, right, it tells quite a lot, that we have a frank discussion about, ongoing issues. It's, you can hardly imagine this in Soviet time. Many Russians, millions of Russians travel to European Union, and they are not brainwashed, and they see internet rather than watch TV, right, to get information, and they absolutely reasonable people, and they can make their own decisions, and I do hope that those who are interested in Russia are doing the same, living in Europe. This is an absolutely new reality. Right, if we make a comparison. So what we can do, this is maybe the big challenge for us, for us educators and you diplomats, to foster, humanitarian exchanges, to create opportunities for your students to come to Russia and to see Russia, for, various types of programs and vice versa, right? So just not to be, sort of addicted to Russophobia or to skepticism against, Europe or NATO, etc. And this is what we can control ourselves, and this is absolutely realistic things which we should work together, right? Us as educators and yours as diplomats. Again, there might be different interpretations. What you said, yes, yes, I would agree. I would agree, you know, many problems come from misunderstanding, lack of information, misinterpretation. But, you know, perception of security is absolutely different. It's absolutely different, you know. So Americans can hardly understand that Russia's concerns. They, at some point, they understood that, you know, when the military bases in the near proximity, it might pose a threat. Cuban Missile Crisis, you remember how Americans reacted. But, you know, moving closer to Russia, coming to Ukraine and saying, okay, guys, you will be in NATO soon. You know, guys, what do you expect? And I think that this brilliant article by John Mearsheimer in Foreign Affairs, where he explained the logic of Russia's behavior, you know, was quite telling. So, you know, yes, yeah, we might say that Russian leaders are realists. That's true. Every country with nuclear weapons, they are doomed to be realists. They cannot just, you know, live, you know, in the skies and dream about, you know, glorious future. You know, we have, you know, quite strong neighbors in the East, right? So we have quite strong neighbors in the West, and we have quite strong neighbors in the South, etc., everywhere. And who will help us? We don't have Article 5. We cannot rely on, you know, countries of CSTO. We can rely only on ourselves. And this should be taken, you know, as something essential. And this should be, just try to put yourself in Russia's shoes, you know, just for a minute. And then you will understand that the logic of Russian behavior, you know, it does exist. Okay, thank you. But again, General Counsel, I agree with most of what you said, and I just do not want to make any further comments.
Thank you. I think we have time for one short question.
Yeah, so go ahead, and then I will.
Well, thank you for the presentation. My question is, Russia, as everybody knows, Russia is located between the West and the East. Not from my point of view, not only geographically, but also mentally. And what is the best strategy for Russia? What policy should it choose for future to be West-oriented and develop democratic institutions, or to be East-oriented and build strong relationship with Asian partners? Thank you.
Yeah, it's $1 billion question, right? So I advise my students who take a class on Russian foreign policy to read Fyodor Dostoevsky, What is Asia to Us? And he said, maybe last story he wrote before he died in 1881. And he said, in Europe we are Asiatics, while in Asia we are Europeans, right? So this is quite telling. So because, you know, even at that time, in the end of the 19th century, Russians were rejected in Europe, and Russia's bad motives to protect Serbs or Bulgarians against Ottoman Turkey were not viewed through the prism of willingness to deliver and protect those who share religion, the same religion, but it was viewed as a willingness to dominate, etc. I think that Russians are Europeans for sure. So just look where our kids go to learn foreign languages and what foreign languages we learn. We are not learning Chinese, maybe, unfortunately. We are learning, you know, English, you know, we are learning German, French, Italian, and St. Petersburg, Finnish, of course. You know, there are several schools where kids can get training in the Finnish language. So people basically voted for European choice of Russia. So Russian institutions are European, but yes, and I think the way how we designed the state and the city 3 centuries ago, it was just for the sake of being a part of Europe. But it's an unpleasant thing to be rejected time after time, right? And this is again, psychologically rather difficult. Asia, what is Asia to us? It's rather comfortable for a number of reasons. We don't have time just to discuss the ties between Russia and China. Some people would say political regime is the same threats, separatism here and there. It's the type of state capitalism, right? It's rather comfortable so far, rather comfortable partner to deal with. We have managed to solve all problems related to security, and territorial disputes are over, demilitarization is over, etc. And I think that, of course, taking into account the role of Asia, growing role of Asia, Russia would be, inclined to invest more to Asian dimension of Russian foreign policy. It's not either or. Mentally, we are Europeans for sure, mentally. And I think that 99% of Russians would agree with me. In terms of geopolitics, we are pragmatic. China is, the biggest market, and, it provides 3/3 of growth of oil consumption. So that's why Russia is looking at China. It's coronavirus and falling prices on oil, is basically a product of problems in China today. So I don't know whether I answered your question, but again, I think that Russia will try to develop European institutions in the future. Maybe not as fast as Europeans expect, but there is a very good saying, Rome was not built overnight, right? Some countries are more successful, some countries are less successful, but it takes time. It takes time. And since Russia is so diverse and so heterogeneous in terms of ethnicity, political experience, economic experience, it might take us longer than other states or smaller states of Europe.
Thank you very much.
Last question.
Last question. Another last question.
I'd just like to make a brief comment, actually. Well, thank you very much. It's very interesting what you've said. But I think Russia's got a fantastic potential in the future. And you just have to look at how the Russian economy grew up to the First World War. In a few years under Stolypin, it was growing at about 7.58%, which is absolutely incredible. And that can happen again, given the right conditions, and so long as Russia can make peace with its neighbours in the West. And, I think Russia has the potential to be a fantastic partner as well of many, many countries. And, personally, I hope that will happen. I'll just take issue with one point. You said that, Russia is... I think you were saying that Russia is sort of still recovering from its loss from the Second World War and from fighting in Chechnya and so on. But I think one shouldn't forget that war can actually be quite positive. And the United States really only recovered from the Great Depression thanks to the Second World War, when its industry grew at a fantastic rate and then stayed highly productive and successful and converted to civilian production after the war. But, that's by the by. But, no, I think that Russia has every chance of being successful economically and politically as a friend of countries which it might not be so friendly with at the moment. So the potential is huge.
So let us hope for better. Thank you.